All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third evening event being held on Zoom by Seabrook Island Birders. I was excited that tonight we've got 74 people who registered for the event from 2 countries. We have Pauline Clark, who's in Canada, our Canadian representative, and everyone else is here in the US. We've got 14 states represented, with about 60% of the people in South Carolina and 40% not in South Carolina. So that's kind of cool. Just a quick note on some upcoming events for those who do like to keep track. We've got several more virtual events. Each month we're holding 2 matinee movies. And for the next 3 months, we'll be featuring a BBC show called Earth Flight. It's on the 2nd and the 4th Tuesdays at 4 o'clock, so you can look at our website if you'd like to join us for those movies. Next month, we have invited the Audubon, South Carolina to present River of Raptors. That's going to be on Wednesday, October 21st, and you'll be seeing information coming out in the next 2 weeks on that program so that you can register. And we're starting to do more in-person events, so if you're on Seabrook, be looking for those. We are continuing to go on the golf course once a month, and there's a few others that will be coming in the month of October. So Ed, if you want to share your screen now, and I'll just remind people that once he shares the screen, you might see a few of the faces on your side, and there should be some little lines. So at least on a computer, there's a single line, which will reduce all the photos to nothing but a little menu. That's the best option for viewing of the slides. And then you can see some other options. So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight Ed and Aija Konrad. Many of you know Ed and Aija because you know them from living here part-time on Seabrook Island, or you know them because you're friends and family. But however you know them, you probably know that among many other things, they have some passions. Ed has a passion for photography, and Aija has a passion for birds. And I was thinking back, and I still think they don't remember this, but I think Flo and I first met Ed and Aija on Beach Walker many, many years ago on a walk that was held by the Charleston County Parks and Rec. And it was probably before we were even here full time. And again, they may not remember, but I do remember meeting them on the beach many, many years ago. So as a reminder, Ed, I'm not seeing your presentation. Did you stop sharing again?
Yes, for a reason.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to them. And then at the end, I'll moderate questions based on the chat and all of you folks if you want to ask a live question. So that's me, and I'm going to mute myself.
Good. Well, good evening. Well, they can see us. It's okay. Aija may kick me under the table a few times here, but it's okay. Good evening, everyone, from our house in Atlanta to your house, and thanks for tuning in to our Seabrook Island Birder evening program. So we've got members, we've got guests. Now we have our family here too, believe it or not. Thanks, family, for tuning in, and we also have some very, very good friends. Before we start the program, Aija has a little disclaimer she'd like to share with you all.
So I don't know if you can see me very well, but those of you who know me will see that I look and sound different a little bit tonight because I have a rather big injury to my mouth. I took a fall and I look like Nanny McPhee, and no amount of makeup will really hide my face. But anyway, the hazards of bird watching. What happened is we were driving home from Seabrook, and we stopped in Augusta to see a rare brown booby. And on the top of Clark's Hill Dam, I tripped and fell face first into the sidewalk. I chipped my tooth, I broke my lip, and that was that. So if I sound a little slurred, I haven't had too much wine. It's just a little bit hard to move my mouth. And we didn't see the bird.
So after we pulled off the road, walked off the dam a quarter mile, got Aija calmed down, cleaned up a bit, I said to Aija, it's time to go home. It's time to drive back the 3 hours to Atlanta. And that's what we did, right, Aija?
No. That doesn't happen. I said we have to go back and look for the bird. And so Ed dropped me off in the middle of the Clarks Hill Dam Bridge, and I got out of the car, and lo and behold, there was our brown booby.
Second.
We can't find it.
Drum roll, please. Hold on, little technology here, and there it is.
There it is. So that's a really rare
The
bird
brown
from South
booby.
Carolina, the brown booby. It's a pelagic bird, was pushed off course by some of these hurricanes probably. And sometimes we just have to endure some hazards with the birding. So bear with us.
So well done, Aija. And that's a little story about adversity and perseverance. I've seen Aija behave that way a lot. And that's a little bit of a good setup for what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of our Lewis and Clark journey. Aija and I have been fortunate over the last 12 years or so to travel a lot throughout the U.S., travel a good many places around the U.S., and hold on a second. And it's all been about our birding and our photography hobby. Now, we haven't been traveling this year for obvious reasons. Most all people aren't traveling. So what we thought we would do tonight is take you all back to our last trip in 2019, our biggest trip, maybe our best trip. So Aija, when we went into 2019 and began to plan this trip, what were you thinking?
Well, as many of you know, in 2018, we had 10 big trips and we did a US big year in the lower 48. So we really were on the go, and we birded up until New Year's Eve, until dark on the coast of Maine for the rare great black hawk. And so when the second week in January rolled around, I was feeling a little bit of a letdown, because what were we going to do next?
So what that was really about is this next trip, when we put pencil to paper, was we needed to go big. We were certainly going to explore, thank you, Thomas Jefferson. So we had some objectives for this trip. It was going to be about birding and photography, of course. It was going to be about Aija finding life birds. Now, a life bird, just to check, in this case is how many individual species Aija has seen in the United States. At that point, she had seen 611. The more you have, the harder it is to find them. There was another objective Aija had, and that at this point in time, Aija had birded in all but 7 states in the US. There were still 7 states to fill in our eBird map. You can get a little sense of then where this trip might take us from the gray states. We had traveled by car lots of places in the US, but had never driven to the coast. That was a goal. But here was the, whoops, wrong way. Here was the piece that brought it all together. I was a history major in college. I'm an avid reader of US history. And like maybe many of you, I had read Ambrose's Undaunted Courage a long time ago, maybe 25 years ago. And I always wanted to follow the Lewis and Clark Trail. So that's what did it. That's what brought this trip together.
So this will be a synopsis, because it took Ambrose 500 pages and Ken Burns 4 hours of documentary on PBS. So we're going to take you on a quick journey of Lewis and Clark.
Okay. Here we go. Here's what we accomplished. We traveled 28 days, our longest trip. We drove 8,900 miles, visited 17 states. Thank you, Hilton. It was a fairly affordable trip using Hilton points.
We filled in the US eBird map. I now have all lower 48 states. We found 209 bird species for the trip and 7 life birds, which was exciting. And we visited 19 national parks and wildlife refuges. And Ed must have shot thousands of photo clicks. And every picture you see in the presentation tonight was taken by my personal photographer, Ed.
Word on the birds, Aija?
Oh, and the 2 birds, my goodness. Those are the 2 birds that are named for our explorers, the Lewis's woodpecker and the Clark's nutcracker, and more about them later.
So I use the word accomplishments here. This was really just stuff we did. These were the 2 people who did the real accomplishments. Meriwether Lewis, William Clark. They were young men, 32, 28 years old. And this was, of course, think back to the time in history. I know our grandkids can probably remember this, hopefully. We have to stretch a little bit. Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, was probably the best presidential deal maker. He bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon for $15 million. And that encompasses picking up what became 15 states in the US. It was a really, really good deal. But Jefferson also, as president, was a man of science. If you visited Monticello, you know that. He was all about science and the natural world. So he wanted to charter Lewis and Clark to commercially find a water route to the Northwest, to the Pacific, to open up trade to the Orient. And they didn't accomplish that objective. They didn't find that waterway. And we'll talk in a little bit as to why, but all of their natural and other scientific accomplishments were just incredible. And Jefferson was really pleased. They traveled 28 months, not 28 days. They paddled, portaged, rode horses, 8,000 miles. 80% of that was on the river, paddling upstream. They influenced settlement of the West. They were amazing negotiators. They dealt with some 50 Native American tribes, not all of which were friendly. So they had to negotiate information, food, and peace. Clark was the map maker. He drew some 140 maps. His map of the Lewis and Clark Trail, believe it or not, was accurate within 40 miles. Can you believe that, over 200 years ago? Of the 45 men and one woman, you may be thinking to yourself, I know who that one woman was. Only one died. They were great leaders. So the point here is these two men, they were officers, leaders, negotiators, traders, diplomats, hunters, doctors, meteorologists, surveyors, geologists, botanists, and naturalists. It's just incredible. And we're going to focus tonight on their role as naturalists.
So they documented for the trip 134 bird species. You can get various counts in various websites, but that 134 is pretty much the standard, with 25 new species identified. The taxonomy was different. They had all kinds of names, common names for the birds, but that's what it comes to. They documented 31 mammals and 16 reptiles and fish and 174 plants, 48 of them being new plants. And in their journals, they wrote captured in amazing detail in 1 million words, all of their expedition. That's how many words were in their journals, 1 million.
I knew a good bit about Lewis and Clark when we took this journey, but I didn't know what amazing bird watchers they were. And we're going to share that with you tonight. Like Lewis and Clark, we had to get to the trail. Lewis and Clark started their actual journey in Pittsburgh, went down the Ohio, through the north, through the Ohio Territory, fitted up their crew and supplies in St. Louis, and then went up the Missouri. We had done the trail in Missouri and South Dakota, so we wanted to pick them up in the middle of North Dakota in Bismarck. So we went north and then west, and from Aija's eBird map before, you can get a little sense as to why we did that. Now, we did some pretty good birding up there in Michigan, Aija.
It's always fun when you're on the way to somewhere that you find an ABA rarity. And that bird was at Tawas Point State Park, Tawas Point Lighthouse. That was the little gull, the smallest gull in the world. And you can see it there in the front and the ring-billed gull in the background. That's a pretty small gull. And it was so exciting to see that just on a quick afternoon. And another target we had in Michigan, in our big year, we had gotten the Kirtland's warbler and seen it briefly, but Ed didn't get a picture. So we went back to the Jack Pine Forest near Grayling, where the Kirtlands live and breed, and there was our Kirtland's warbler for Ed.
Probably one of the best guides we've ever had, an Audubon guide, knew these birds so well. And she just, somehow that bird came up and we got a great photo of it. Now, still up in the upper peninsula of Michigan, we wanted to take a peek at Lake Sinclair. And so what happened was we had a piping plover surprise, Lake Superior, I'm sorry. And we just went out to see the lake, and on this gravelly coast was a Whitefish Point, thank you, Aija, was a piping plover on a nest. It was in a cage. Mark Andrews, I'm sure you can relate to this with all the work you're doing with piping plovers. Know that these piping plovers, as we've written about them, are an endangered species. So this hatching was very important. We learned that on that day, one of those eggs was going to hatch. just like the turtles are tracked at Seabrook Island, where you all know the days they'll hatch. So we waited and waited and looked, and we were treated to, you can see the eggshell in the back, and you can see that brand new piping plover chick. So that was quite a thrill for us to see. They winter at Seabrook, but what goes on the other end when they in fact nest.
Well, sometimes on these cross-country trips, I don't know how Ed talks me into these things. I throw up 5 reasons why we can't go, why we shouldn't go, what we shouldn't do. And all of a sudden, I'm looking out the window and I say, oh, geez, we're in North Dakota. So there you can see us by the North Dakota sign, our first trip to North Dakota. So exciting to check off a new state. And what a pleasant, pleasant surprise it was. We knew that there would be a lot of grasslands in North Dakota, but most surprising was that there were a lot of wetlands. So that was really exciting. And there's 2 birds we saw in the wetlands, the yellow-headed blackbird, which is a noisy visitor, and they were breeding there and in large flocks. And on the right-hand corner, upper right, is the black tern. We see the black tern at Seabrook only briefly during migration, but they were nesting there, and that's a most gorgeous black tern in full breeding plumage. And grasslands, oh my goodness, grasslands are so exciting to just drive along. Miles and miles of dirt road, nationally protected, and so important. Our movie a couple weeks ago for SIB talked about the importance of national grasslands. You just drive along the prairie and you can bird out the window, and there are 2 beautiful upland sandpipers that were often perched on posts. It's such a hard bird to see in South Carolina, but they were often seen there.
As a photographer, I love it when they pose for me like they did. So the next day, we get on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We picked up the brown signs following the trail now. We're headed north to a place called Fort Mandan, and we're going to follow those brown signs now all the way to the Pacific. The top right-hand photo is me, pointing up the Missouri River. Keep in mind, for those 2,000 some odd miles that Lewis and Clark paddled the Missouri, they were going upstream the entire time. It was really incredible.
And there in the middle, you see a western hawk that we saw quite often, the Swainson's hawk with that beautiful brown bib. And one of our goals in North Dakota, we knew there were western grebes and they were breeding. We don't have western grebes here on the East Coast, and it was so exciting to see a large group of several hundred western grebes with their young. And on our bucket list was to see western grebes carrying babies on their back. And when I saw this parent carrying the 2 babies on the back, we almost didn't see it at first. I actually began to cry. It was so beautiful.
I got a little weepy too. It was really a great sight. And that was the goal of us, to see that spectacular sight. And in fact, we did. So now we pick up the Lewis and Clark Trail. Our journey starts. We're in Fort Mandan, North Dakota. This is where Lewis and Clark and their team spent their first winter. They befriended the Mandan Native Americans who helped them with directions and food. The interpretive centers along the Lewis and Clark Trail are just incredible. The fort is an exact replica down to the square inch of the fort that Lewis and Clark built for the winter. And why did they know that? Because it was all in the Lewis and Clark journals. There's a replica of Meriwether Lewis's room. There's me standing with those very, very tall figures. And Aya, what are you doing up there in the upper right-hand corner?
Oh, that was a buffalo skin that kept them warm during the winter. If I had had to stand there 30 more seconds, I would have collapsed on the floor from the weight of it. It was so heavy. And also at Fort Mandan is where they picked up their French guide, Charbonneau, and his wife. He was going to be their guide and a cook, and his Indian wife, Sacagawea. He had bought her from the Hidatsa Indians. She had been captured from her Shoshone tribe, and he bought her as his bride. And she was there that winter at Fort Mandan. She was pregnant, about 17 years old, and she gave birth to her baby, Pomp, they called him, and she carried that baby with her to the Pacific on her back.
The peanut butter and jelly sandwiches there, if you followed us on Facebook, you may know we eat a lot of peanut butter and jelly on the road. There aren't restaurants, there isn't time, and it's really a good snack. And there we are looking over the Missouri River. The boats, the keel boat was what they carried all their supplies up the Missouri. And at this point now, they sent the keel boat back, and they also sent it back with some of their discoveries in terms of how many birds did they send back?
Oh, they sent back to the White House, to Thomas Jefferson, 4 magpies, 4 live magpies. Only one made it to the White House alive, but that was an exciting bird for them to send back to Thomas Jefferson.
And they continued their journey up the Missouri then with their pirogues, the white and the red pirogues, they were called. So Lewis and Clark now from this point are going to head pretty much straight west, trying to find that waterway to the Pacific to get to here. We took a little different route. We took the Yellowstone River, which was Clark's return route home, because we wanted to take a little detour we'll tell you about. Then we picked them up at Great Falls and then through Idaho, Oregon, and to the Pacific. Now, a little quote from Meriwether. Their party, our party, was in excellent health and spirits. We were all anxious to proceed. Not a whisper of discontent was heard, and all was in unison. You see Aija there, gazing at the Missouri, quite content until, that's not a great photo because I wasn't asking it to pose, but that's a rattlesnake. And
a large rattlesnake.
And Aija, like Meriwether Lewis, trod within 5 inches of this rascal, but she passed before the snake could put himself in a striking attitude and fortunately escaped his bite.
So I'm posing for a picture and Ed says, move that way. And lo and behold, I look down and there's a rattlesnake. Yeah. You could have heard me too, across North Dakota.
So Lewis and Clark are going to face a lot of hazards, such as grizzly bears, etc. Fortunately, that was really our only hazard on the trip. Right.
Oh, so here we are. This is the 4th of July, and we are at Teddy Roosevelt National Park, a real sleeper of a park, not that well attended because it's so remote and out of the way, but it was absolutely stunning, not crowded. There were herds of wild horses grazing. You can see me standing on the bottom with my scope, and there's a herd of buffalo and their young behind us. Buffaloes roamed freely through the park, past our car, and there are 2 birds that we saw in the park, Midwestern birds and Western birds, the lazuli bunting. Lazuli, like named for lapis lazuli, with my busted lip, and for its beautiful blue colored head, and the lark sparrow with its beautiful harlequin colored head. And those were some visitors. Not that many birds in the park. It's a little bit remote, but it was beautiful to see those 2.
So thank you, Niche Dana, for giving us the tip to see Teddy Roosevelt National Park. It was the 4th of July. So at the end of the day, we drank some spirits. I don't know that we appeared a little sensible from its effect, and there was no fiddle. We didn't really dance, but we were pretty merry until the sun went down at 9 in the evening.
Here we are at some grasslands again, and I just love, this was my favorite grassland of all, the Little Missouri grassland. And the birds in grasslands are usually solitary and secretive. You will have a hard time finding these birds. And I was after 2 life birds. That would be the Sprague's pipit on the left corner and the Baird sparrow on the right corner. And the Baird sparrow is extremely secretive, and the only way to really find him is when he sings. And fortunately, he was just wailing away, and Ed even got a picture of him singing. It's a very rare Western sparrow that's really hard to find and very elusive. And the Sprague's pipit they called the skylark of the Missouri skylark, because you don't see it until you're practically on top of it, and it goes straight up into the air on a crazy flight and then spins down with this crazy whistling song. So it was so exciting to find the 2 life birds. And in the middle there on the bottom is the Wilson's phalarope, which was breeding there and actually buzzing our heads to stay away from his nest area. And the top bird in the center is a horned lark. We see those in South Carolina too, up at the sod farm, but always a joy to see those little horny feathers on his head.
I'm always amazed at how Aija finds these birds. There's certainly no guarantee they're going to be there. but her planning, and then it was a lot of hours
Took us
up
2 days to find
up and down that dirt road in the grasslands, but she knew what she was looking for, and there they were, perseverance.
So, you may or may not know, but Thomas Jefferson was an avid bird watcher. He kept a record of his birds. He watched birds regularly, twice a day at the same time, recorded all his birds in a book. He identified 125 species in Virginia, and he kept a pet mockingbird named Dick. And the mockingbird lived in the White House in his study. It stayed in a cage, which he often left open. And it would fly out, it would perch on his shoulder, and it even took food from him. So he really, really loved birds, and Lewis and Clark knew that, and they were avid birders, and so they were keen to send him a lot of descriptions and specimens of anything they could find on their expedition. And the illustration on the left is of two birds that they actually discovered, the Lewis's woodpecker and the Clark's nutcracker. The illustration was made by Alexander Wilson, who was called the father of American ornithology, and he was a good artist. We often think of Audubon, but there was also Alexander Wilson, and he painted those birds from the description and the skins that they had sent back. They had to kill most birds to really get good descriptions. That would not be acceptable today, but binoculars weren't invented until the early 1900s. So everything that they did, they had to measure and record.
They also were a food source as well. Now, the way Lewis and Clark described these birds was incredible too. Now, Pam and Craig and Nancy and Kathy and Mark, you all do eBird. So imagine if your eBird description sounded like this. Oh, where are we going here? I know, it's just not coming up. So hang on a second, there we go, okay. So imagine if your eBird description sounded like this. They called that Western tanager initially a Kuski river bird. So we met a beautiful little bird today, plumage delicate, neck and head of a fine orange, yellow, and red. Orange yellow prevails most. Red has appearance of being laid over a ground of yellow. Amazing, just amazing the way they observed and described these birds.
I misspoke. Binoculars were invented in the 19th century, not the 1900s. So there were no binoculars.
Let's dig a little deeper on the birding and the history if we could. William Clark was the illustrator. Meriwether Lewis was the birder. So the four panels you're looking at here were illustrations that Clark drew of the heads of four birds, and then he described the birds on the panels. Upper left, he called it a pied brant. We know that today as a greater white-fronted goose. That's a photo I snapped back in 2013. And the species just happened to be in the neighborhood, and they were returning in considerable quantities for their breeding. Lower left, Clark called that a white gull. We know that today as a northern fulmar. We took that bird on a pelagic trip on the Monterey Bay. That's a pelagic bird, a seabird. It doesn't come onto land. And Clark described it with a web feet and a remarkable beak. Can't see that, but it's got a real big knob on its beak. The bird in the upper right, they said the first large buzzard that they saw when they actually killed it and measured it, which they had to record the species, 7-foot wings, weighed 30 pounds. That's, of course, the California condor that we saw in California. And I love the one on the lower right. It's almost as if we were looking at the same bird 200 years apart. Clark called that the cock of the plains, and the Native Americans told him that they were very common in the Rocky Mountains. Well, that's a greater sage grouse that we tracked down for 2 hours in Colorado and took that photo. They weren't that common, but it was just amazing to go back in history and see the focus that these two gentlemen had on the birds themselves. So let's get back on the Lewis and Clark Trail.
So the only physical evidence anywhere on the trail is at Pompey's Pillar in Montana. And it was the end of the day, and we got to Pompey's Pillar. We had to run quickly to the top of the to the hill to see this, but it is where William Clark engraved his name in sandstone. And there you see Ed taking a picture of the engraving. Gosh, it was kind of emotional knowing that one of them stood in that exact spot. So that was very exciting. And there you see Ed with one of the canoes. I swear that thing was so heavy you could hardly move it. I can't imagine how they loaded those up and traveled in them.
What's the drinking going on there on the
Oh,
lower
so-
right-hand side? What's that all about?
Every night at dinner, we would plan for the next day. I would look at eBird lists if it was going to be kind of a birding day. And that night I discovered, I was very excited that there was a black Rosy finch where we were going the next day, which was exciting because we never really got very good pictures of that. So that's what we did as we had our libations that evening.
Just a quick point here on leadership. Clark was the leader as Lewis was the leader as tapped by Jefferson, and Clark was his assistant, but they kept that from the men. They were co-leaders. On our journey, we don't always agree on everything, but we were co-leaders too, because there was the need for a real balance here between finding the birds and exploring the history. And I think we did a pretty good job sticking to that balance. So we took a diversion, the Beartooth Highway. Maybe some of you have been on it, an incredible 70-mile drive through Montana and Wyoming through the Rockies. The point here on the Rockies is this is the first time we're seeing the Rockies. We can only imagine what Lewis and Clark were thinking, maybe 70, 800 miles north of us, when they're seeing these formidable mountains, used to only seeing the Alleghenies in the east, thinking, what in the world is this all about? There we're seeing the first Clark's Nutcracker right here. I'm taking a photo of where it's supposed to be at the top of that pine.
And you can see it's July 7th, and up on top of the Beartooth Pass at 11,000 feet, there's lots of snow. There were people skiing on some sort of slushy snow. You can see the mountain goats there, and we're in a sleet storm by that sign that says 11,000 feet. It just started momentarily for about 10 minutes sleeting. So we have this large tundra, and we're on the border of Wyoming and Montana. We know this Rosy finch is somewhere, but my oh my, where do you look? And sure enough, we started scoping. There's Ed trying to photograph. And sure enough, and the snow melt on the side of the road, voila, there is our black Rosy finch, which is a real treat to see. They are only at very high elevations in the summer on the tundra, and it was a real joy to see it.
I knew this bird was going to be somewhere on the Montana-Wyoming border, and she found it. And that's a pretty stunning bird, really a stunning bird. From on the way back up into Montana, we stopped at Yellowstone National Park, and just mammals. We're not going to talk about mammals, just birds, but we saw some in Yellowstone, of course. The mammal, that's a pronghorn in the upper right, and the way, the way Lewis described that is, I killed a peculiar goat. It was about the height of a deer. Horns come out of immediately above its eyes, brains in the back of its head, and it has eyes like a sheep. It is a pretty peculiar looking animal. We saw bison, maybe sometimes a couple of hundred. Again, we can only imagine what it must have been like 200 years ago to see 20,000 bison on the plain. That's a young grizzly, of course, taken from a distance. Meriwether, Lewis, and Clark, they had two views of this. At first, they called this the white bear. And that first quote was really about Indians or Native Americans feared this animal because they only have bows and arrows. But we're great marksmen, so we're not afraid. About 6 days later, Clark had a little different tune. A very large and terrible looking animal, which we found very hard to kill. We shot 10 balls into him before we killed him. They would have many, many dangerous encounters with the white bear.
Now we're headed to Great Falls, Montana, and the Great Falls were one of the most difficult parts of their journey. One of their biggest obstacles, Meriwether Lewis rode ahead. He knew about the falls from the Indians, and he heard a fall, but then he heard 4 more falls. There are a total of 5 of them, and they had to figure out how to go upstream by these falls. There's a wonderful interpretive center there where it shows life-size replica of them pulling their boats, their canoes up the side of the falls. It took them a total of 28 days till they made this passing, and it was quite a very, very difficult. And in the middle of those falls, believe it or not, we saw one white American white pelican, which was really funny in all that rushing water.
So we talked earlier about dealing with adversity and perseverance. And can you imagine how any of us would have behaved today? How much whining we would have done here? But here's what Lewis said about his men. Their fatigues were incredible, some limping, others faint and unable to stand. Yet no one complains and all go with cheerfulness. Just amazing, amazing journey.
So, as Ed said, we were co-leaders of the expedition, and we had a really good harmony going of days when we would bird and days when we would do history. And if many of you know me, like during the big year, we were very driven, and we did what you call combat birding. We would bird from sunup until sundown. And so we had to make sure beforehand that we weren't going to kill ourselves doing these things and that we had a good balance. But here was a day we took time out for birding at Benton Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Montana. It was spectacular. I think we saw one car on the drive, which was great. And in the left-hand corner, we have ruddy ducks during the winter at Palmetto Lake and at the maintenance area. There's a ruddy duck in breeding plumage. It is absolutely stunning with that beautiful rust and that bright, bright blue bill. It was amazing. And here we saw more grebes, and this is probably my favorite grebe. This is the eared grebe with that beautiful red eye and those yellow feathers around its ear. There were over 100 of them nesting together. They're colony nesters. You can see in the middle there's the floating nest with the eggs on it, and it was spectacular to see them. And sure enough, they had some babies on their back. And you'll have to look very carefully in this picture because the babies are like little zebra-striped birds, and they carry them. They carry them to keep them warm if the water temperature might be too cold, to protect them from predators. And they do it for, I think, about 10 days, it said. So it was really spectacular to see them. And I can't believe Ed got this wonderful picture of them from the car. Yeah.
From the car. So now Lewis and Clark from the Great Falls are headed up the Missouri, headed south. And they describe in their journals these cliffs that they were passing. Just really a spectacular view that we saw as well. We, of course, did some birding. I spotted this beautiful Bullock's oriole right about in this spot, right about here, as a matter of fact. A bald eagle by the cliffs, a beautiful, beautiful rainbow at night. And so we were birding, but yet envisioning this journey that Lewis and Clark were taking. What I'm pointing to here is the Missouri now, there's some decisions to make. It's turning into tributaries, and Lewis and Clark come to what's called the Three Forks. Which way do they go? You know, a wrong turn could take them days out of the way. So they took the right fork, they called it Jefferson. It's a tributary, but now they ran into two really big challenges. These tributaries, and we're right here at Three Forks, get narrow and narrower and narrower, and they find their way down in a place called Lemhi Pass, where all of a sudden the river's end. It's actually the mouth of the Missouri River. There is no waterway to the Pacific. Problem one. Problem two, they're now staring at 8,000 or 9,000 foot mountains right here. They're right in them, called the Bitterroots. And how on earth are they going to get across those mountains to still continue their journey? So we picked them up now in Idaho at a place called Lolo Pass, and they're going to take the Lolo Trail through the Bitterroots, a very bad passing.
So here we are. We have never been to Idaho, and we're about to enter the Pacific time zone there. You can see on the sign. And we were greeted by, and Ed and I have, neither one of us have been to Idaho, we were greeted by two birds that are real favorites of ours, the beautiful yellow and black evening grosbeak. They're usually high up in the trees and you hear them, but it's very hard to see them. Well, they were on the ground eating some seeds, and there was a whole group of them. And it's just one of my favorite birds. It's in steep decline, I think, from loss of habitat, but it's really a great bird. And the other bird on the left corner is the varied thrush. That's also one of our favorites, and Ed is still trying for the perfect photograph of it. It just is so elusive and hidden. It has this haunting, beautiful trill that it makes, and you always hear it before you see it, and we were thrilled to be greeted in Idaho by that varied thrush.
Those are the birds. You want to mention the Lewis and Clark challenges going on?
Oh, so this was a terrible part of the journey. They were really hungry and almost starving and facing a very, very difficult winter. And they resorted to...
Oh, I'll say that.
Oh, okay.
So they picked up some horses, if you will, from...
Oh, the Shoshones.
We did practice
Sorry.
this. Go ahead.
Right. Okay, I forgot to tell you about the Shoshone tribe. So they encountered the Shoshone tribe, and Sacagawea was a captured Shoshone, and she actually was reunited in this meeting just by sheer coincidence with her brother Kamehameha. And the Shoshones were very good to them. They gave them horses to cross the Bitterroots, and they gave them a guide to take them across. But it was going to still be very, very tough.
Word in the birds, I always laugh. These birds may not always be there where they're supposed to be, but it's almost like those grosbeaks said to themselves, well, you know, Aija's coming into Idaho tomorrow morning. She hasn't really filled in her eBird map, so we're just going to stand right underneath the Welcome to Idaho sign so that she can get it. So back to the bad passing. Where I'm standing was a place near there called the Hungry Creek. So what's going on here? They can't navigate this creek. It's too shallow. They're on horseback. They have a guide. There's no trails. Winter is setting in. They're cold and they're starving. Just a quick little quote from one of the privates. A little trouble. There you go. Our officers having a fine colt killed. Hunger made us think it eat delicious. Well, imagine that. They're eating their horses now. And it's September, but it is cold. And Lewis's comment on the cold was, I have been wet and cold in every part as ever was in my life. I was fearful my feet would freeze in thin moccasins that I wore. So they persevere through the next few weeks into the winter, and they work their way down the mountains into better weather, down onto the Clearwater River, where it's now they can navigate this river, but now they need boats. So they get to a place, this is called Canoe Camp, where they're able to cut down some very, very large pine trees, and they're able to build what was 5 dugout canoes. These dugout canoes, 30 foot in length, 3 foot wide, they held 4 to 6 men, but fully loaded with men and supplies, 2 to 3 tons. And they would construct these by burning them out in just a few days. Just unbelievable. So now we're headed down the Clearwater, following the route of Lewis and Clark, headed downstream now to the Pacific. Clearwater here, through Idaho and Washington, turns into the Columbia going through Oregon. That's us towards the end of the day, really thinking about we're almost to the Pacific. But of course, we took some time out to do some birding.
So we took some time to do some birding on Lewis Peak, not named for an explorer, but I had 2 target life birds that are difficult to find and only in a very small part of Idaho and Washington. And my least favorite bird to chase after the flycatcher, which is so difficult, and especially when you're out west and there's so many of them and they're so hard to tell apart unless you hear them. And we knew that there would be a dusky flycatcher and a Hammond's flycatcher. So the dusky one is the wet one in the rain with the bug in his mouth, and the Hammond's is the smaller one. And we were very excited to find them both and hear them both at the top of this peak. We drove endless miles on this dirt road. Our car is covered with dust, and it was very exciting. And the other bird is a western warbler, a cousin to our black-throated green, who lives high in conifer elevations, and that is the Townsend's warbler. That has a beautiful little trill that you hear.
And you're drinking wine again?
Oh, I'm drinking wine because at the end of the day, if you're in the state of Washington, my goodness, you have to stop at a vineyard and have some delicious Washington State wine, which was a really nice end to our day.
I think I'm going to send these photos to Subaru when we're done here. I think they could use them in their ad. So let's go back to the birds again in history and the way Lewis and Clark described these birds. Some eBird entries. On the lower left, they call this bird the Missouri plover. It's, of course, our American avocet. That picture was taken at Bear Island WMA that many of us know about. So Lewis described this bird perfectly. Head and neck, light brick dust brown, the beak curved upwards instead of downwards like most birds. And when it feeds, it immerses its beak in the water and throws its head back, beak from side to side. A perfect, perfect description. This was the magpie, spelled a little differently. This is the black-billed magpie. I took that picture in Anchorage, Alaska when I first started photographing, and I still like the picture. Clark described this as a corvus species of the crow species. That was not correct, but has a long tail, upper part, and feathers and wing is of, let me move this, is a purplish variated green, black-white belly, a beautiful thing. And how about this bird, Aija?
One more word on the magpie. The magpies, they didn't know were in the United States. They only knew them from Europe of legend. So they were particularly excited to find magpies on their expedition. And the middle bird, they called the black-headed jay. It had a blue shining color with a very high tuft of feathers on its head. And we know that as the Steller's jay. It's a very social bird. They've commented on its cha-cha-cha note. And they are often in picnic areas and around areas where they're scavenging for food, and always fun to see because they're so noisy.
Okay.
So this is probably the most famous quote of the expedition. Oh, the joy. And that's what William Clark said when he first viewed the wetlands that were led to the Pacific, and I just can't even imagine how they felt when they knew that they had reached the Pacific and they had reached this area. And there, Ed and I are on a very foggy, chilly morning on the coast of Oregon. It was just so exciting to see the Pacific. I felt like we were the explorers, and there we were. And we moved further a little bit down the coast. In the background there, you can see all those big rocks to Haystack Rock, which is a famous landmark in Oregon. And we were so surprised and blown away that on Haystack Rock were nesting tufted puffins and common murres. There must have been hundreds of murres and a good nice number of puffins. So that was an extra added bonus that we didn't expect to see.
Not a great picture of a puffin because I'm standing about here when I took it. So that's a better picture right there.
Yeah, that's a good big
That's
one.
a good clear picture. Black oyster catchers on the base, cousins to our American oyster catchers, U5, some of us know, on Seabrook Island, the banded bird. And Lewis and Clark spent the winter here now, built another fort, Fort Clatsop. Meriwether Lewis went quiet in his journal, didn't write, and historians aren't really sure why. Some say maybe he was just totally devastated that they didn't find the waterway to the Pacific, but he did suffer from depression. Others say he went into a deep bout of melancholy and depression. We were not depressed, but we were sad at this point, Aija, weren't we?
I was. I had just lived this expedition. We had listened to 18 CDs of Ambrose's book in the car, and we were at the Pacific. It was kind of over, and it was really kind of a little bit of a letdown the next day. I had to pick myself up and say, okay, we're going to persevere on. Plus, we had 3,000 miles to go to home.
When in Oregon, let's do a little more exploring and birding.
Here we are at Crater Lake National Park. Wow, that lake is so amazingly stunning. My shirt is the same blue color as the lake, and up there, that mountain bluebird, Indian legend has it that the bluebird was gray until it dipped its wings into Crater Lake, and it was just absolutely gorgeous.
These woodpeckers are called acorn woodpeckers. They're common in the West. They're one of my favorite birds to photograph. They're always in a pair. They always look really, really happy, and they always pose really nicely. This is another view of the Clark's nutcracker taken there at Crater Lake. Now, Aya still doesn't believe me when I tell her this. That is not blue sky you're looking at. I shot down at this bird. That is the blue water of Crater Lake. It's just incredible.
And there's another one of our favorite Western birds, the black-headed grosbeak, a cousin to our rose-breasted grosbeak here in the east. And there it is feeding its young some beautiful crab apples that you can see in the background there. And there I am. We dipped down into Northern California at Redwood National Park, which was just always a joy to walk through the Redwood forest.
So we did a little more birding along the beautiful Pacific. Aya's got her eBird map totally filled in now. Well done. So look, if you're in Southern Oregon, if you're in Northern California, you might as well drop down to Lake Tahoe and go to your good friend Pat and Paul's 50th wedding anniversary. Pat and Paul, I hope you're still out there. So we did some celebrating with Pat and Paul at Lake Tahoe. We were much pleased at having arrived at this spot, and we ordered quite a few drams actually, and we spent the evening with much hilarity. I don't know that we were singing, but there in fact was some dancing going on.
So with birders, it's always, no matter how great the trip has been, there's always like, I just want to get one more bird. I need one more bird that I might not be able to get. It's just here in Northern California. So I made a deal with Ed. The next morning, we had to get up very early, and we had 2,500 miles to go,
Yeah.
3,000 miles to go to drive home. So I said, I'll make a deal. If we can get up at sunrise, which was 5:30 in California at that time, we got up at sunrise, that we could go to this remote campground where I was looking for another life bird that has a very small range, and that was the white-headed woodpecker. So we set our alarm, and when we got to the campground, I set my phone timer. I said, we're going to stay for 30 minutes and then we're going to leave. And at minute 28,
Boom.
Ed.
Now, this doesn't happen very often, but it is a real thrill when I find the bird, especially if it's a life bird. So there it is, the white-headed woodpecker, a life bird for Aya, and a life photo bird for me. So minute 28. So 2,400 miles from home, a 35-hour drive. Time's about run up out here, so we're not going to slug through this drive home. There we go. Little of the scenes along the way. We stopped in Missouri, not yet Georgia, just for a quick stop.
And we were staying overnight outside of St. Louis, and I saw a brown Lewis and Clark sign. And I said, well, where's this? I said, let's follow this. It's another sign for the trip. And it happened to go to the boathouse where they started their trip in St. Charles, Missouri. And there was a museum of the boathouse that had replicas of their boats. So that was such an exciting note to end on. We had a glass of wine across the street at a little bar where we could look out at these statues.
And again, the end is the beginning. So this was the beginning of Lewis and Clark's journey. They camped there. They waited for Meriwether Lewis to finish up some business. He joined them at St. Charles, and then they headed north on the Missouri. And that's their trusty dog, Seaman there, a rather large dog that I'm standing next to.
He was with them the whole expedition.
So it was a fun night. Then from there, a quick stop to see our granddaughter Rosemary in Nashville, and a couple of tired travelers hit the Welcome to Georgia line after 28 days. So our last slide, these are two of my favorite photos of Aya birding. Our family will recognize one of these. It's hanging up in her TV room. This is a photo of Aya birding in North Dakota at Teddy Roosevelt National Park we talked about. This is a photo of Aya birding in South Dakota a few years ago at another national park. So the point there is, give Aya a tree on the plains and she's gonna find a bird for you. I love those two photos. There's a couple of photos of us on our journey. So we had a wonderful time. Hopefully we shared some of our trip with you, and maybe we've all learned something about how great the Lewis and Clark were as birders. So thanks so much for your time. And Nancy, I'll turn this back over to you.
I hope you're all still out there. It's going to be so sad if only 5 of you are left.
Yeah,
No,
this
there's
is a
still-
real trick now. Is anybody still there?
Yeah, there's still 42 people, so.
All right, okay.
Yeah, and feel free to show your photos. Does anyone have any questions? Nobody typed any questions, so I'm wondering if anybody has any questions out there. Just remember, you can take yourself off mute. I can't take you off mute.
I want to know where's Dean.
So, I mean, can I let her see me though?
Are you looking for Dean Moore?
Yeah.
He's here.
Here, Dean, where are
Oh,
you?
there he is. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. Ooh. So how long you have the 130-minute countdown, but do you typically put a limit on it?
No, not really. No, we just really had to leave that day. And so that's why we did that. I think if we hadn't found it in 30 minutes, there might have been an extension put on it.
Some of these other
We were
ones-
just lucky. It was really fortuitous that we found it in 28 minutes.
There's a birding saying that the birders use, just 10 more minutes. That
5 more minutes, 5 more
10 more
minutes.
minutes
One
seems
more
like
bird.
it can go on forever, so.
But for some of these other life birds, like how long did you spend looking
Yeah, it's a good
through
question.
your scope trying to search them out?
You just never know. You just never know. You could try to have the most information that you can for looking for it. And, you know, you just get lucky.
Well,
And sometimes you don't get lucky.
And as an example, the two light birds on the prairie, the sparrow, the Baird sparrow, and then the Sprague's pipit, we spent 2.5 days looking for those birds, walking and driving up and down that dirt road in the grasslands, and there were lots of sparrows there, but it wasn't that sparrow.
Yeah.
And finally, I heard the bird, and then we got a look at it. And the Sprague's pipit was a little easier because it flies up in the air like a helicopter, but again, it took a while. Plus, the other thing is I'm trying to get a
Yeah,
picture.
so that complicates our
so that-
task because we always want to get a picture
Yeah.
too. So,
So a good long while to answer your question. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes not. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank Ed and Aija for sharing their journey and all of their special birds. And all of you for joining. Is there a question?
Yeah, just a quickie. Which one, if you were going to pick one, was the most exciting? Not because it was a life bird or anything, but the variety and the, I don't know, the terrain, whatever. Is there one that
Well,
stood out in your mind?
to me, the breeding grebes were so exciting because that's just something that was just a kind of a bucket list thing I wanted to see. So that was really, really exciting for me to see them.
where
Even
was
though
that?
I've seen both of them in North Dakota and in Montana. So that was just a behavior that I wanted to see in a bird. And then probably that white-headed woodpecker was pretty exciting at the very end. It was a great way to cap off the journey because you know how birders are. You'll say, oh yeah, it was really great. And we did with this and this and this. Oh, but we didn't get this. So that was exciting to get that one at the end.
And that woodpecker is a hard bird to find. It's really elusive. So it's not, that was a tough one to get. So that was satisfying too.
And Ed, did you have one in particular?
I'd say the two graves with the babies, we wanted to see that. And we've seen many photographs of that and hoped so much, knowing it was breeding season. And we looked and looked and looked and we saw babies swimming and we didn't see any on the backs. And we said, well, this isn't going to happen. And then all of a sudden there they were in both cases. Just amazing. And we got really, really excited to see that. And then once you saw an adult with the chicks on the back, then you saw them everywhere once you first saw them. So that was probably the most exciting birding moment that I did. And the other thing about too, just our traveling, people will say to us, well, how long does it take you to get to Seabrook? That's about a 5-hour, 6-hour drive from Atlanta, right? Well, no, for us, it's a 12, 14-hour drive because there's so many places to go and birds that Aija wants to see. So it's can be a whole day from sun up to sundown.
It is very patient.
I can hear Flo giggling in the background, like, don't be dragging me around like that, Nancy. I could never make it to Maine if I did that all the way up to Maine.
Well, and the fortunate thing we have is my interest is photography. So it's a real challenge and a treat for me to photograph these birds that usually Aya finds for me. So that's what keeps me interested in this, is the photography side. We're lucky that way, I think. I think Carl and Kathy, you have a similar interest there with the two of you. So, okay.
Anybody else? Judy, do you want to wrap up things?
Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you for doing that, Ed and Aya. As Nancy said, we do have another Zoom scheduled. You'll be seeing a blog on that. It's towards the end of, I think it's like the 23rd of October, but you'll be getting a blog on that and saying what it is that Audubon was going to be giving us a presentation. We've got a couple walks coming up. Some with Big Day is on the 17th of October, and we're going to schedule maybe 3 or 4 different walks around Seabrook where people can wear their masks and we'll go birding together. And then we're going to go to Bear Island. We're going to do a Bear Island trip again on the 24th of October. So we've got some. So look forward to seeing everybody, and I'm glad that we can see everybody here on Zoom. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks.
Wonderful program.
Great job, Mom and Dad.
Thank you, David.
And Aya, do you want me to leave this up for a minute?
Yeah, leave it up and our family can stay on. Okay, that's
I'll
good.
leave it up. And
Yeah,
I'll
Lucy,
keep
Rosemary,
mine.
Karen, Jamie, David, stay on. Thank
So
you.
any of the
Good night, everyone.
Konrad clans can
All right.
stay on and visit for a little bit, or
That's
any of the
cool.
friends.
Thank
Good job,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
So funny.
I wanted to say hi, Ed, Dave Konrad, first time caller, long time listener. I noticed in that statue of Lewis and Clark there was a dog. What was his name?
His name was Seaman.
Yeah!
Yes, and he got lost once, and they almost couldn't find him.
What was that one quote?
No, there could still be people on here.
Karen's there. No, Tim's there. Good. And
Hey, that was great.
Dana and Tammy are there.
Great.
You guys all see Dana and Tammy? You haven't seen Dana and Tammy in a long time.
Oh, I'm so
There's the
relieved.
parrot, here's the
Could
parrot.
everyone understand me okay?
Here's
Bob,
Pat
Bob,
Paul.
you did a great job. We're so used to hearing Dad talk. Mom, you did a great job.
Hi, Roscoe.
Here's
Hi.
Roscoe.
Oh, there's Jamie. Oh, that's it weird.
Jamie and Tim Weir. Hey, Tim.